and welcome to chapter 17 of the Miraculous fanfiction, A Glitch in the System. This is both written and narrated by Milady Samantha. Hope you enjoy this part. Marinette just lay against his shoulder, searching for comfort as Adrian rubbed his hand on her shoulder comfortingly. He desperately wanted Marinette to know that he was there for her. Marinette was extremely important to him, and she had been since the day they had met. Adrian wanted more than anything to prove that he cared for her. A dolled-up blonde girl walked past the pair and was beyond infuriated.
Ugh, Duban Chang?
She screamed, startling the brunette, making her head jolt away from her newfound comfort.
What do you think you're doing, snuggling up with my Adrikins?
She yelled angrily. Marinette gulped. Chloe was her lifelong bully, and though it may not always look like it, Marinette was often frightened by her. In that moment, Marinette felt powerless. Only up until Alia had joined their class and became her best friend, Marinette wasn't strong enough to stand up for herself. She always ate alone, sat by herself in class, and was overall a very sad and lonely girl. It wasn't that Marinette didn't have any friends. Of course she did, but because of Chloe, she chose to sit alone. She thought that her friends would be better off if she distanced from them, as she didn't want them to get pulled into the never-ending drama between her and Chloe. Marinette wasn't even sure why Chloe was so hateful towards her. After all, she'd never done anything wrong. Right now, Marinette really didn't have the strength to deal with Chloe. Adrian glared at Chloe. She had beyond annoyed him recently.
Chloe, I'm tired of how you treat Marinette. I can spend time with her if I want to,
he hissed protectively. Chloe's face fell into a very uncute and angry pout as she'd fallen silent and dramatically rolled her eyes before walking off into lesson.
Ridiculous, utterly ridiculous,
she shouted from inside of the classroom. Marinette looked up at Adrian in awe after seeing how protective he got over her. Marinette blushed as Adrian's eyes peered into hers.
Are you okay, Marinette?
He said again, sweetly. Marinette sighed. She couldn't lie to Adrian despite what happened between him and her alter ego.
No, not really, but merci, Adrian.
Marinette smiled sheepishly, as Adrian smiled sadly.
You know, Marinette, you can tell me anything and I'll always be here for you,
he said as he reached for the girl's hand and squeezed it tightly with his own. Marinette's eyes widened in surprise at the contact, but she allowed their fingers to intertwine as she again rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed in that position until the end of class. When the bell rang, Marinette shot up as she ripped herself away from Adrian. Adrian was saddened by the sudden removal of Marinette's warmth.
I have to go. We can talk outside later?
Marinette said in a hushed tone as she awkwardly backed up, almost knocking herself into a nearby trash can.
Of course. A bientôt, Marinette,
Adrian said with a shy smile. The pair then walked off in opposite directions. By the way, in case you don't know what a bientôt means, it means see you soon in French. Marinette rushed into the bathroom and ushered herself to a stall. Tiki came into view as she glanced worriedly at her holder. Marinette chaotically ran her hands through her hair.
Did I just spend the last half an hour cuddled up to Adrian?
Marinette shouted as she smacked her arm against the store wall.
Yes, Marinette, but you should consider calming down,
Tiki reasoned. Marinette was unsure of what she should do.
Tiki. When he finds out that I'm Ladybug, he...
Marinette began before Tiki put a stuffed hand to her holder's lips.
Shh, Marinette, everything will work out. Maybe Adrian will be a little overwhelmed, but he'll come around. After all, he really does love you,
she squeaked. Marinette allowed her face to flush a deep red as her expression fell.
Yes, but he loves Ladybug, not Marinette Dubancheng,
Marinette said sternly. Tiki frowned.
And only until recently, you only liked Adrian Agreste and not Cat Noir,
she said. Marinette knew that Tiki was right. Now Marinette was debating in her mind whether or not she should tell Adrian that she was in fact Ladybug. Although maybe she needed more time, she was very unsure and afraid of any possible consequences. Adrian continued to walk down the hallway of the school. He was headed to his next class, which happened to be gym. But now Adrian really didn't want to attend class. It wasn't that he didn't like sports, because he didn't actually mind doing them. It was the fact that he now couldn't get Marinette Dubancheng out of his head. Adrian's thoughts were racing with worry for the raven-haired girl he'd held so dearly to his heart. Adrian wondered if she was upset because of him. After all, she did tell Cat Noir of her love for him, and what if she was sad because he hadn't returned her feelings? His eyebrows furrowed, and he all of a sudden felt drained. Marinette had loved him since the day they had met, and he'd only just discovered it. He thought of her alone, crying, because she was too scared to tell him how she felt. His heart panged with guilt. Should he just tell her that he knew? No, he couldn't, because then she'd figure out that he was Cat Noir. But Adrian just simply couldn't push aside the nagging feelings of his guilt. It was then that Adrian began to wonder about his own feelings. Yes, Adrian had loved Ladybug since she'd shown her true strength. But Ladybug had never returned those feelings. Whenever Adrian thought of Ladybug now, all he could remember was her betrayal of his trust, and his heart sank. Why did she seem to like him more after finding out his identity? That question was lurking in his mind since she threw herself at him so longingly. He then began to wonder if he knew Ladybug. After all, he did run into her outside the girls' toilets. So they must be in the same school? Adrian shook his head. But who would be Ladybug? A girl with blue-black hair, pigtails, and the most captivating bluebell eyes. Marinette again flashed into Adrian's mind. No, it couldn't. She can't be, he thought. Marinette pulled herself together as she strolled out of the bathroom. She decided that she would finally tell Adrian the truth. After all, he deserved to know. Marinette was terrified, but knew that it was the right and fair thing to do. After all, she knew Cat's identity, so he should know hers in return. Adrian noticed Marinette walking towards him, and his face heated up. He noticed that she was no longer stained by her mascara, and she looked fairly calm. Her raven hair was instead pulled up into a pair of buns, just as when she was Multi-Mouse. Adrian blushed at the side door. Even he couldn't deny how beautiful she looked as she confidently strode towards him. Adrian? She started as her knees buckled in anxiety. Adrian immediately locked his eyes with hers. He could sense that something was about to happen, but he was unsure of what.
I need to talk to you,
Marinette said without a hint of nerves. Adrian smiled at her.
Of course, Marinette. What is it?
He questioned curiously. Instead of giving him an answer, Marinette tugged at Adrian's hand.
Not here,
she spoke again before dragging Adrian away. Adrian was amazed by her confidence and the way she just took him away without even giving him time to respond. Marinette darted her eyes around the corridor in hopes of finding an empty classroom.
Aha!
She sputtered before again dragging a confused blonde into an empty classroom. Marinette locked the door behind them as Adrian cocked his head at her in confusion. Marinette smiled shyly as she let go of his hand.
Adrian, there is something you should know.
She stuttered as her eyes darted around the room. Adrian again looked at her and gave her an encouraging smile, signaling her to continue.
I'm just scared that if I tell you, you'll no longer want me around,
she said as her eyes began to fill with tears. Adrian frowned and moved towards her.
Marinette,
Adrian said sternly as she spun to meet his gaze. Her hand felt the warmth of another entwining with it, and her hand was gently squeezed.
I will always want you around,
he finished as he shot her a sweet smile. Marinette felt her cheeks heat up.
Before I tell you the big thing, I wanted to say that, Adrian, I've loved you since the day you gave me your umbrella,
she shouted as her eyes tightened shut. Marinette knew that Adrian already knew of her crush on him, but she hadn't actually confessed it to him, but only to his cat noir self. Adrian blushed. He was unsure of what to say.
Yeah, you don't have to say anything. It's okay,
Marinette sputtered, quickly noticing the silence between them.
Now for the second part,
Marinette began.
I am...
Thank you so much for listening to these chapters. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'm sorry that I leave it on a cliffhanger. But don't worry, the next part will be out shortly. Goodbye.